Hello and welcome to another time-thrashing, monkey-blasting episode of What Happened, the investigative YouTube-style pop culture media show that your mama warned you about. It's been a little while since I used that one. You know, 2023 has been a banger year for video games, and if you exclusively get your news from recent broadcasts, it was a year with absolutely no concerning negative trends or major issues at all. Speaking of no major issues at all, allow me to bring up the Embracer Group, who, at the rate they're going at, might have closed down another studio by the time I finished this sentence. Unfortunately, one of those studios was the newly reformed Free Radical Design, who of course have an indelible legacy intertwined with our subject today, the fondly remembered but never forgotten FPS franchise, TimeSplitters. But this wasn't the first time that Sergeant Cortez, Harry Tipper, Corporal Hart, and the rest have faced adversity, as the fan-lauded series didn't exactly have the smoothest of development histories even in the best of times. So polish your time crystals and unholster your sci-fi handguns as I answer the question, what happened to TimeSplitters?
It's time to split!
In 1998, around 5 staff members from Rare's GoldenEye/Perfect Dark team, including David Doak and Steve Ellis, decided to go at it on their own, as they had grown tired of Rare's managerial style and were looking for some fresh opportunities elsewhere. So they set up Free Radical Design and immediately set about securing funding from a publisher, any publisher, to make the type of games that they wanted to make. They then drafted up a pitch for something that ironically had nothing to do with time and/or splitting. In an interview in issue 218 of Retro Gamer magazine, David Doak explained that Free Radical's first title had originally started off as something quite different, and only through happenstance and timing did it morph into the silly arcade shoot-bang it's known as today. The project that we pitched to publishers when we were trying to get funding was actually the game that became Second Sight. The working title was called Redemption, and it was going to be a first-person narrative-driven shooter with psychic abilities. The pitch for this telepathy title eventually convinced another big UK-based studio, Eidos Interactive, who clearly saw the value in employing some key members who worked on the 8 million plus selling GoldenEye 007, and thus contracted them to make Redemption into a PS double ballin' exclusive, and within a 3-year timeline. Because of Eidos's good relationship with Sony, they were able to procure PS2 dev kits, which were not easy to come by in 1999, but Sony management became even more impressed by the fact that Free Radical were able to get a first-person demo up and running so quickly, which Doak credits to Steve Ellis's technical wizardry. As the team came to grips with the console, the rumor mill started to churn that Sony's machine was in for a pretty significant delay. Free Radical therefore started to rethink their approach and deviate from the initial plan, as they were wont to do. With the extra time afforded by a hardware delay, the thought process was that it might be more advantageous to instead scale down to a simpler, more accessible shooter experience that would be available at launch, rather than spend the 3 years making an ambitious story-focused epic later on in the console's life. If one were to put themselves in their shoes, this does seem like the more appealing plan. Since this was the team's first title under a new roof and on new hardware, it made more sense to create something that was on the safer side rather than shoot for the stars the first time out. So that's exactly what Free Radical did. They zeroed in on what they felt would be the most fun thing they could make in a short period of time, which was a souped-up version of GoldenEye's multiplayer mode, no longer restrained by the N64's many technological shortcomings, as well as cramming in as many playable characters and weapons they could imagine. There was just one tiny issue though. Free Radical did not consult the higher-ups at Eidos Interactive about this massive change in plan, instead deferring to the ironclad adage of asking for forgiveness rather than permission. There was just one tiny issue with that though. Eidos Interactive, once they found out, did neither. Their contract was for a serious, narrative-heavy single-player game and not a madcap multiplayer shooter, so Eidos straight up refused to continue supporting them unless they went back to the original design. Free Radical, however, strongly believed in their new plan, but for them to actually achieve it, they would need to resort to some truly radical tactics. In that same interview with Retro Gamer, Doak was pretty forthcoming in regards to Free Radical's attitude around that time, and their solution to get around their publishers' staunch refusal to see things their way. It was all very novel to us. We had never been in charge of our own destiny before because we had just been working at Rare, but we told Eidos what we wanted to do, and they said, absolutely not. Don't change what you're doing. We don't want that kind of messing around going on. Knowing that arguing the point would get them nowhere, Free Radical boldly went above Eidos management's heads and took their case directly to Sony, showing them what they were working on and how Eidos were fighting against it. Very quickly, TimeSplitters as we know it was a go. The Chad-like balls of this move can best be summed up by saying, we were a bit brash, which Doak admitted to Retro Gamer. Once things officially got moving, the team focused on creating a variety of maps, characters, and weaponry, without much thought of it all being thematically consistent. In fact, the whole time-traveling narrative was just an excuse for the staff to make whatever they felt like, not wanting to be constrained by, say, a movie's script or any one set time period. Hell, even the eponymous alien race, the TimeSplitters, were slapped together without much thought, with the staff taking one of their random character models used for the horror levels and repurposing them to be the series' main antagonists. This was a pretty surface-level way of justifying the jumbled setting, with David Doak affectionately calling it lazy sci-fi, but that was perfectly fine to Free Radical. They were more concerned with making the multiplayer as fun as possible, which would be pushed even further by the map maker, a feature the team were especially proud of. Even though this seemed like a pretty valuable and innovative thing to have in your video game, especially in a console one, it was another feature they had to fight for, as Eidos upper management apparently saw no value in it. All those problems aside, when TimeSplitters launched right alongside the PS2 console, it was clear it wasn't hitting above its weight class, as it wasn't graphically stunning nor grand in scope, but what it did deliver was undeniably fun, and was certainly a standout from the rather ho-hum launch lineup of competing titles. And while it did sell quite well, it was handicapped by the PS2's admittedly slow first year at market, which would kick into high gear a year later with the release of titles like GTA 3 and Final Fantasy X. Free Radical were encouraged by the game's success regardless, and immediately launched into the sequel, laser-focused on delivering more of everything: new characters, over-the-top weapons, a more fleshed-out single-player mode, an endlessly replayable suite of challenges, and an even more detailed map maker. They did all this in less than 2 years, delivering a sequel not only on the PS2, but the Xbox and GameCube as well, with the latter being a particularly thorny subject between both developer and publisher. Free Radical felt for TimeSplitters become an even bigger success, it needed to be on all 3 major consoles, but Eidos were notoriously hostile towards supporting Nintendo's machine, something I already covered in my GameCube video. An unnamed exec even went so far as to say that they had no relationship with Nintendo. Even though they technically did, they were just really salty about it. Eidos were so adamant against this GameCube port that Free Radical then started talking to Activision about possibly handling the publishing duties for it instead, since they were already in discussion about their other in-development title, Redemption, or Second Sight, which at that point didn't have a publishing partner. These conversations spooked Eidos so much, they ran that shit the hell back, repledging their support for the GameCube port, although it was begrudgingly, I'm sure. When TimeSplitters 2 hit store shelves in October of 2002, it received waves of critical acclaim and plenty of love from fans, especially on the consoles with built-in 4-player support, which, along with some pizza, probably fueled many a sleepover for the months and years to come. Even former staffers who worked on it cited the game as peak Free Radical in the Retro Gamer piece. Hell, TS2 was so well loved, even Sean took the time to play for a few seconds on a busy Monday morning. When it came to sales, however, Free Radical couldn't help but think it should have performed a lot better. Now, the sales were good, mind you, as even IDOS were pleased, but given how much more improved the sequel was and the fact it was available on more platforms, the team were still a little crestfallen. This disappointment then turned to dissatisfaction with how much or how little they felt IDOS had marketed the game, and given how many times they'd already clashed over creative decisions, Free Radical started looking for someone else to shack up with for their next project. Now, remember, hindsight is 2020, and things were quite different in the video game industry circa the mid-2000s, so you can't exactly blame Free Radical for this, but the new someone they chose was Electronic Arts. Now don't get it twisted, this seemed like a great move at the time, because it's back when EA was publishing the hot-ass smoking bangers like Def Jam, Fight for New York, Burnout, SSX, and Everything or Nothing, but still, this wouldn't turn out exactly like Free Radical had hoped. In fact, compared to their situation with IDOS, it would kinda get even worse. Speaking once again to Retro Gamer, David Doak plainly stated, "We naively thought that EA are better at selling games than IDOS, so we ended up doing a deal with EA. Working with EA was disappointing." If you've been paying attention, it's been pretty clear that IDOS had taken issue with specific big choices Free Radical had made, but they largely left the day-to-day development alone, allowing the team to go crazy with quirky characters and oddball humor. The problem with EA, however, was that their style of game development was largely powered by marketing, with several staff members recalling they'd be subjected to long meetings with EA reps where they would be presented with mood boards, reference material to contemporary pop culture, and an overlying desire for the next TimeSplitters to be more serious and in line with current FPS trends, because they were clueless on how to market TimeSplitters in its original guise. They grab a whole bunch of scenes from some films they like and they show it to you and they say, "Look at this clever vision," and their clever vision was just, "We really like Wesley Snipes in Blade."
Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?
Despite a longer development time, Future Perfect, which released in March of 2005, wasn't the big leap over its predecessor that TS2 had been. Although it should be noted the map maker certainly did see a big leap, as it would now allow players to share their creations with each other over the magic superhighway that is the internet, but was only available on the PS2 and Xbox, of course. Sorry, GameCube.
No one knows what it's like.
Fortunately, aside from Cortez now being positioned as the Master Chief of the game, locking him in as the only playable protagonist in the single-player mode, the spirit of the franchise was still very much present in Future Perfect, although fans are still debating to this day which was the better of the two sequels. What definitely wasn't better was the game's sales, which, while I can't find hard numbers for, ex-FR staffers seem to indicate that they were on the softer side, mostly attributed to, again, poor marketing on EA's part, and the meteoric rise of the likes of Call of Duty and Halo. But even before that, things were already less than ideal behind the scenes, because Second Sight, the game which technically started it all and released the previous year under Codemasters, also greatly underperformed, putting Free Radical in a precarious position. Undaunted, work started on a fourth TimeSplitters anyhow, and continued for about a year until it just sorta petered out, because every publisher Free Radical spoke to turned up their noses at the thought. Monkeys, mustaches, and unmonetized map makers were out, and put in their place were 2 weapon limits, waist-high cover, and World War II. In the Retro Gamer article, David Doak stated that by that point EA just didn't care, and admitted since they were kind of hard to work with, most other publishers didn't want to take a chance on them either. Eventually, seeing the writing on the wall though, Free Radical just threw up their hands and decided that they had better start making the types of shooters that publishers were funding if they wanted to stay open. That resulted, of course, in the ever-infamous Haze, a critically reviled and low-selling attempt at catching the eye of the mainstream gamer, which did no such thing. Korn still thinks it's the shit, though. While Haze's failure was a massive blow to the company, the true final nail in the coffin came with the cancellation of a title most people didn't even know existed for a number of years. Star Wars Battlefront 3, a nearly completed and by most accounts phenomenal game, had the lightsaber brought down on it for no reason whatsoever. In addition to continuing a well-established spin-off of Star Wars, BF3 represented Free Radical's desire to stay alive. Where they once strived to simply make the games they wanted to make, they were now willing to develop one based on a licensed IP with a controlling owner. As for its sudden and secretive deletion, well, LucasArts just so happened to be going through a massive restructuring and management change at the time, which always means a swath of cancellations, and this one just happened to be the last contracted work Free Radical had in dev. The company was on death's door by the tail end of 2008 and subsequently announced it had filed for bankruptcy, with its staff of 185 strong getting cut down to a mere 40. All was not lost though, just mostly. The remaining staff were able to hang on until it was announced in early 2009 that Free Radical were being purchased by Crytek and would thus be renamed to Crytek UK, who then proceeded to do not much of anything. Despite reportedly a €50 million investment, all they were used for was to support Crytek's main studio in developing ports of Crysis 2 and 3, never actually making their own all-original title. Well, kinda, but we'll get to that. In 2010, talk of a new TimeSplitters started to surface, with Crytek UK's managing director, Carl Hilton, saying to Eurogamer that they have met with other publishers about the possibility of bringing the franchise back in some way, but failed to cite names or details, or anything really. Yeah, we'd like to make a new one, sure, why not, seemed to be the overall sentiment. By early 2012, this hadn't really changed, but Crytek's position in the industry certainly had. The Crysis sequels really didn't take off like they were supposed to, still lagging far behind other comparable franchises. So Crytek announced they were leaving the AAA boxed retail game space and would adopt a more free-to-play model, as well as something called G-Face. I don't feel like looking that up. Anyway, that same June, Crytek's CEO, Savat Yurli, spoke publicly about the situation, saying to The Escapist, "Look, I wish we were working on it, I will say that. I think hopes are high, but change has to happen in the platform space. I'm very excited potentially about the idea of a TimeSplitters for G-Face." I'm not looking that up, whatever it is. Anyway, he went on to say, frustratingly, "The thing with TimeSplitters is, if we made a sequel to TimeSplitters, nobody would accept this apart from some fans, and we don't know how big the fan community is, unfortunately, and we don't want to design this as a packaged goods game that launches on a console, and even if we wanted to, I don't think publishers would like the idea. That is the truth, and that was the truth even before we bought Free Radical?"
What the hell are you talking about?
Then, later that August, there was another update, sorta, by Mr. Yurli via an interview with VG 24/7. And if you thought that last statement was frustrating, wait just 5 more seconds for this next one. "I tested through my official blog to see how big the TimeSplitters community is, and while the volume of responses was quite high, we feel it's not high enough yet. That being said, it did indeed trigger a deeper evaluation of what we do with TimeSplitters, and I can only say this for now, we might have some surprises coming soon." And they sure did, but I think most can honestly say that it wasn't a 100% positive surprise. Because instead of, say, paying someone to make a new TimeSplitters, like, I don't know, it's original creators that you literally own, Old Yearly announced that they were instead not going to pay a bunch of fans from the TS community to create TimeSplitters Rewind, an odd project that even 10 years later has not yet come out or been officially cancelled. What this deal boiled down to was simply allowing fans under the name Pantheonics to use the TimeSplitters IP and assets to make an HD best of package that combined the multiplayer elements of the first 3 games together. So that meant all the characters, weapons, and maps, and eventually allowing that to be downloaded by players free of charge. Things would predictably get worse in 2014 because Crytek UK employees started to raise a stink about missed payments by their parent company because, try not to be shocked here, Crytek's moves in the free-to-play market were not in fact money moves, and thus were looking to sell off any assets they deemed expendable to stay afloat. Said assets were Crytek UK, and the game they had just started development on, a sequel to Homefront that nobody asked for. Both were then sold to Koch Media / Deep Silver, who then renamed the studio to Dambuster, who eventually released the game as Homefront: The Revolution, which, while not very good at all, at least contained a very good Easter egg. Buried in the game's code for years was a fully playable 4K version of TimeSplitters 2, like the whole game, both the single and multiplayer. Warning! You must actually own a copy of Homefront: The Revolution and play like 5 hours of it before you can unlock this much better. If you'd like a bit more insight on the whole Homefront debacle, feel free to check out my Dead Island 2 video. Now let's just fast forward a little bit to 2018, where things started to get more exciting to any TS fans who happen to have their ears close to the ground. At some point, Koch Media quietly purchased the TimeSplitters IP from Crytek, and publicly announced this acquisition in a news blurb which made for a tantalizing morsel for fans of a franchise that had been absolutely starving. We are hugely excited to have acquired TimeSplitters. The original games gave fans a massive content offer and provided a pure and genuinely fun arcade shooter experience. We have many fans of the TimeSplitters series among our own staff who are passionate about creating a product that will thrill today's gaming audience. Of course, details were still being kept under wraps because it was early days, but said details then proceeded to be unwrapped in 2021, with the official announcement that TimeSplitters fans had been waiting on for the last 16 years. Free Radical Design had been reformed as a brand new studio filled with a mix of new and seasoned talent, many of whom who had worked on the original trilogy. And best of all, the two that were placed at the very top were David Doak and Steve Ellis. Neither had actually stayed on with the original Free Radical once they had transitioned to Crytek or to Dambuster, and instead had taken a long sabbatical from active game development. All the juiciest bits were kept to a minimum, like target platforms, a release date, or even if it was a sequel or not, the air was electric regardless, with Ellis proudly saying in the press release, "To finally be able to confirm that this studio has been formed and that we have a plan for the next TimeSplitters game is incredible. While we cannot tell you anything more at the moment, we look forward to sharing information in the future." As you may have correctly predicted though, that information was never shared. Before we get dragged kicking and screaming into the reality that is 2023, let's rewind a bit back to TimeSplitters Rewind. While the fan project soldiered on even after the Koch Media announcement of the purchase of the IP, updates did start to slow down, despite assurances that the project was in no immediate danger. Hell, updates even continued after the announcement that a new official TimeSplitters game was being developed, by its original creators no less. At some point though, you gotta assume between the IP changing to a completely different company and then that company being bought by another much bigger company, shit might get messed up along the way. But fingers crossed it'll be back eventually, especially in these dark times. Because if you were ever a fan of TimeSplitters, the timeline we are currently living in is indeed the worst. After that 2021 announcement, the rumor mill would occasionally stir whenever there was a new video game-focused event like Gamescom on the horizon, with fans hopeful that eventually something would be shown or just confirmation of the basic details. Was this going to be a reboot, a remake, a full-on sequel? Everyone was desperate for news, so you can imagine how devastating it was when, in early November of this year, reports out of Free Radical were saying the studio was being unceremoniously shut down, and their game, whatever it was also being cancelled. If you'll recall, at the end of my recent Saints Row video, I painted a very vivid and bleak picture of what was happening and what was to come, which was the Embracer Group, the parent company of Koch Media, making a bad $2 billion deal that fell through in spectacular fashion. And to recoup this monumental blunder, the heads of the unfeeling conglomerate started to go through their stable and cut loose any studios that were deemed too expensive to keep running, were in between projects, or who had barely started one to begin with. This is due to the fact that the Embracer Group bought like 173 different studios across the globe in anticipation for that $2 billion investment that never came. The reaction from the Free Radical staffers when the closure was finally made official in public is nothing short of heartbreaking. Well, that's it. Officially the final day of our time at Free Radical Design, and an entire studio, just over 80 people, is out of work. The last day at FRD was very different from what I imagined. I don't think it sunk in properly just yet, but handed my keys in and left the building the last time. It's time to split. But it was a statement from the head of QA, Kevin Ellis, on his LinkedIn, which really encapsulated the current state of affairs and the grander problem that's been plaguing the industry as of late. As the sun sets on my last day at Free Radical Design, I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to collaborate both with industry legends and with emerging talents who will no doubt shape the future of the industry. Free Radical Design was a hub of creativity, but sadly, we join an ever-growing list of casualties in a broken industry where entire studios are treated as replaceable cogs in a soulless machine fixated on nothing but share prices. Aside from PlayOn, a subsidiary of the Embracer Group, confirming the closures and thanking Free Radical for their service, best of luck, and other meaningless sentiments, there's been no further news about the TimeSplitters franchise. Is it just dead, being moved to another studio? Will they sell it to a publisher that actually does care about its brands and employees? As of right now, we simply don't know. Out of all the episodes I've done here on What Happened, this has to be one of the most unbelievably unfair, easily the most disappointing and upsetting way a story can end. For a franchise to have been teased for so long and to be out of the limelight for the better part of 2 decades, to then actually getting a second chance at life with most of the original creators back on board, only for it all to be taken away before they even got to show their work with the rest of the world. And all just because some incompetent ogres at the top botched a business deal that was bad for the entire industry from like the very beginning? And then for hundreds of people who had nothing to do with that having to pay for it? It just really makes you wish that Cortez could just leap back in time with a smirk on his Vin Diesel-y face and stop this whole canon event from happening because, well, it just sucks. Yeah, so happy holidays, I guess? If you know of any other tales of misery from the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or time hop over onto my social media things. See you next time, and thanks for watching.